Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time. This is our fourth class, and today we are going to be reviewing Daf 22 to Daf 28, and we are picking up on Daf 22. Um, and we were talking last week about a pot that has a hole in it. In the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, like we have nowadays, there are two types of pots. A pot without a hole at the bottom is seen obviously as a pot. A pot with a hole at the bottom is seen to be connected to the ground when it's sitting on the ground. So the Gemara says, what happens if, let's say, this pot is somehow in Eretz Israel and outside of Israel? What is happening? So the Gemara tells us that if the whole of the pot is in Israel, but the branches go outside of Israel, again, you can imagine someone who lives on the border. So then the question is, do we view this, let's say, tree as being in Israel or outside of Israel? Again, as we mentioned last week, the repercussions are if, let's say, it's Shemitah year, if it's in Israel, you can't do things to the tree. If it's out of Israel, then you can. So there's actually a machloket if it's seen as in or out. And the machloket is basically, interestingly, where do, and those of you who are into gardening, I know Elisa likes to garden. So the question is, the Gemara discusses, does the tree get its nutrients from the ground, or does it get it from the air, meaning from the leaves? And I think it's just a great machloket. I think also scientifically very accurate. Um, and then the Gemara says, well, that's only if it didn't really grow roots yet. But if it grew roots, then everybody agrees that most of the nourishment come from the roots. If a tree, so now we're going to keep going, right? Let's say the tree is, now the tree is not in a pot. It's planted in the ground, and half of it is in Israel. Now we're talking about like half the trunk is in Israel and half is outside. So then we have two options. One idea is, right, let's say the half, right, let's say the right half that's in Israel. So the fruit that grows on that side is considered fruit from Israel, and the fruit that comes from the other side is seen as outside of Israel, right? Or, right, again, is this idea, right, again, as the roots draw in nutrients, do the roots do the nutrients get kind of mixed up in the trunk and go everywhere? And then they say, right, every fruit is seen as half in Israel, half outside of Israel. Or do the roots, right, draw up their nutrients and give it to the fruit that grow on that side of the tree? Again, I think just a fascinating conversation in terms of how trees work in terms of their nutrients. Um, Okay, let's go back to, we were talking about writing the get on parchment, and this Gemara ends by discussing three types of, I guess we'll call it parchment, but hides. Again, this comes from animal skins. So one is called matzah, which sounds like matzah, but it's a type of, it's untreated parchment or hide. And it's the Gemara talks about if you carry it on Shabbat, how much is the amount that's seen as significant. The second one is called chefa, and this is salted, but it's not treated yet, and this is used to make an amulet. And the third one is called diphthera, and this is salted and partially treated. And this you could use to write a get on it. But again, normally we use what's called cloth or parchment, and that is completely treated. Okay. And the last, before we get to the next Mishnah, the Gemara tells us that if you brought the document to Israel, you have to bring it directly to court, and you can't wait a few days because again we're concerned that maybe the person will erase part of the get. Or the Gemara says no, you actually have up to 10 days because no one's really going to forge the get because there are witnesses that signed on the document, and therefore no one's going to forge it because we have these witnesses who know exactly what they signed. Okay, let's go to the Mishnah at the bottom of Daf 22. The Mishnah tells us that anyone can write a get, even someone who is a deaf mute, insane, or a minor. Right? Whenever we see this grouping of people, in Hebrew it's cheresh, shoteh, katan, these three people, this grouping of people is what's called people who don't have what's called da'at, right? Who don't have mental capacity, right? In the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, a deaf mute, right? Where this is before Helen Keller, right? If you were deaf and mute, the assumption was you could not, uh, you could not communicate. And because you couldn't communicate, the assumption is you didn't understand anything, right? They thought that it meant you did not have a mental capacity. Shoteh is someone who is insane, right? So again, not mentally competent. And a katan, a minor, is not mature enough to have full mental capacity. So the Mishnah tells us that even these people can write a get, and even a woman can write her own get. Now we know that the man has to own the get. So the Mishnah tells us that the woman can write it, and she is intelligent enough to understand that she has to give it to her husband. He has to own it, and then he can give it back to her in order to divorce her. And so too, the man can write the receipt for the ketuvah. Again, that goes to the woman, and she returns it to the man. All of these things can be written because the Mishnah tells us that the validation, the kiyum of these documents is by the people who sign it. And since it's by the people who sign it, we are less concerned about how it's written. Now, not everybody agrees with this, and we'll see this in the Gemara. So, the top of Daf 23, the Gemara tells us, again, as I mentioned, even if they don't have da'at, if they don't have mental capabilities, they can still write it as long as an adult is supervising the writing, right? So there needs to be an adult who's supervising, and then it is okay. However, a non-Jew cannot write a get because a non-Jew who's an adult is acting on their own accord, and therefore we can't really control what his intent is, and we don't really know what his intent is. Or the Gemara says no, even a non-Jew can write it. Again, as we mentioned, because it's really about the people who are signing it that give it validity, and therefore the writing does not have to be with proper intent. Again, the concept is lishma, right? And we're going to see that that's actually a machloket, right? Rabbi Meir holds that even if you found a get in the garbage, if you sign it with the proper intent, it's valid, right? So Rabbi Meir says that it's the signing of the document that makes it valid. Therefore, the writing is less important. Now, obviously, you need the right words, but it doesn't matter in terms of intent. Rabbi Elazar says, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, right? It's the writing needs to be lishma. You need to have proper intentions when writing it. Therefore, he would not agree that a minor or the deaf mute or the insane person, he would not agree that they could write it. And he holds that it's the writing has to be with proper intent, and the witnesses that give over the get are what make it valid. Okay. Another opinion is that if these people without mental capabilities write the get, they have to leave the toref. Again, the toref is the part that is individualized, where we write the name of the husband, the name of the wife, the city, the date. That so some say that if these people write it, you have to leave that part blank to be filled in with proper intent. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that everyone can bring a get, right? So if you're following, all these Mishnayot are everyone can fill in the blank, right? Write it, send it. So here it says everyone can bring a get, meaning can be the agent who brings the get, except for the following people. Cheresh, Shoteh, Katan, right? Again, are three people who don't have da'at. So the deaf mute, the insane, and the minor, plus a blind person and a non-Jew. These five people cannot bring the get. So the Mishnah continues, if they received it in this state of invalid agency, and then let's say they change their status, right? So the minor grew up, or let's say the blind person was healed. So that is invalid because when they received it, they were not valid agents, right? They were not valid shlichim. If they received it when they were healthy, meaning valid agents, right? So a person who could see, a person who has mental capabilities, and then they became one of the five people that we just mentioned, and then let's say they got better. So then the Mishnah tells us that that's valid because, right? So the Mishnah tells us the rule is if they began their agency, right, their shlichut, and they ended it when they were mentally competent, so then it's valid. Okay, the Gemara continues to explain. So the Gemara explains, right, why can't a blind person bring a get? Because they're not going to know who they got it from or who they're giving it to, right? How are they going to know? Right, because they couldn't really identify the people. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, but they can identify people. You can hear their voice. You can recognize them. So the Gemara says, you're right. So maybe the reason is because they can't say bifanai nechtav. If you remember, we learned last week and the week before that when an agent comes with the get from another country to Israel, they have to say that they saw this get being written and being signed, right? So they couldn't have seen it being written or signed because they cannot see. But let's say he had sight and then he lost it. So the Gemara says actually it is a valid agency because he could say he saw it being written. So the Gemara says that that does work. Okay, a slave can accept the get from the husband, or the Gemara says no, because according to Jewish law, the get doesn't apply to a slave, and therefore he cannot be an agent. Right? If the law applies to him, he could be an agent, right? But if not, so then not. Um, Okay. Um, so the Gemara says that another case is a slave can get a get for his friend. Right here, the get is to one second. Sorry, the slave can get a get for his friend who's owned by a different master, but not from his own master. Right? He can't transfer to somebody else who is owned by the same person because as soon as he acquires it, the master acquires it and he can't transfer it to somebody else. Okay, the next Mishnah on Daf 23 tells us that even women who are normally invalid to say that somebody's husband died, they can bring a get. Who are these women? If you remember, I think we learned this in Yevamot. Remember, we talked about, I think, Yevamot and also in Ketuvot, we talked about people testifying that somebody's husband died, right? And now they're allowed to get remarried. So the Mishnah tells us that there are certain women who are not allowed to testify. Who are these women? Basically, anybody who would have it out against the wife, right? So who would that be? The mother-in-law, the daughter-in-law, the co-wife, right? All these women who do not like the wife, and therefore they want to mess her up. So they are not believed to testify that the husband died. However, they can bring the get. So the question is, why could they bring a get? So the Mishnah explains because it's a written document, right, that was signed by witnesses. And therefore, they can't lie. I mean, they could, but we're going to assume that they're not going to lie because we can always check with the witnesses to see if this is a valid divorce document. So much so that even the wife can bring her own get as long as she can say bifanai nichtav, right? Meaning she can act as the agent, um, as long as she saw it being written and being signed. Okay, so now the Gemara explains, right? So the Gemara actually brings a braita that says actually these five women are not believed, right? Again, because they have it out for the wife. Um, Okay, then the Gemara makes a distinction. Maybe it depends where they're bringing the get from. If they're bringing the get from within Eretz Israel, from within Israel, so then they're believed. But if they're bringing it from outside of Israel, they're not believed, right? Maybe they could be checked and therefore we believe them, or the opposite is true, right? The Gemara gives both both scenarios. So these hostile women are believed, therefore, so too the wife her says, and the wife herself. And on the top of Daf 24, the Gemara says again, why are all these people believed? Because they have to be able to say that they saw the get being written. So as long as they say that, we're assuming that they're not going to lie, and therefore we believe them. Okay, let's say let's say the husband gives on Daf 24, the husband gives her the get and then says that she isn't divorced till she gets to the court, right? Again, this is when the wife is the agent, and he says, right, you're going to be the agent till you get to court. Therefore, she has to say, bifanai nechtav, again, I saw it being written because she's the agent. Or another option is that he makes her the agent to take it, and then she becomes the agent to receive it, right? Because she has to receive it for herself. And therefore, that's why she has to say the declaration. Or another option, she needs to appoint another person to be the agent to receive it, right? Because she can't give it and receive it. So maybe there has to be somebody else. And the Gemara says, or the last option is, the case is that she needs to appoint another agent to bring the get, and then she receives it as herself. And with that, we finish the second chapter of Masechet Gitin. Okay, the third chapter begins with the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah says, if the get isn't written for this specific woman, so then it's invalid, right? Again, we saw before the machloket, if the writing has to be lishma, right, with proper intent. So this Mishnah seems to imply that it needs to have proper intent for this woman. You can't use a get that was written for somebody else, even if they have the same name, right? And then the Mishnah continues. Let's say a man has two wives with the same name. Do not try this at home. I don't know why a man would marry two women with the same name, but he's married to two women with the same name. And then let's say he says to the scribe, write me a get, saying I'm going to divorce, I don't know, Sprincy, and I'll decide which Sprincy I want to divorce when I get home. right? So the Gemara says no. Again, you have to write it specifically for that wife. You can't decide after it was written. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to discuss it. Um, so there are different levels of proper intent, right? So one option is, let's say that the get was written as a practice, right? A guy walks down the street and he hears the scribe writing a get. Yosef, am going to divorce Sprinza. And the guy's like, oh my gosh, I'm Yosef and my wife is Sprinza. Oh, give me that get. That's perfect. So the Gemara says that doesn't work because it wasn't written for the people. It was just like a practice document. Or maybe it was written for somebody else with the same name. Again, don't try this at home. Don't live in a community where Yosef is married to Sprinza and then there's another Yosef married to Sprinza. It could be complicated. Um, so maybe if it was written with the same name, it is valid. And the Gemara says, no, right? It must be written for this husband and this wife, right? Again, the verse says, Vikatav la. It needs to be written for her, meaning this specific woman. And there's no such thing as retroactive designation, right? This is what's called in Hebrew breira. We've seen this before. Breira means I'll decide later, and then retroactively it's going to, change the status, right? So if I choose wife number one, Sprinza, so then all along that's what I thought. So the Gemara says, no, it doesn't work like that. You needed to have wife number one in mind when you had it written. Um, okay, let's say a man wrote the get to his wife. He can use the get even though there's someone in the same town with the same name, right? We're not concerned that it's going to get lost or confused. He could still use it. Um, now, the Gemara tells us that if a man used one of these invalid gets that we just mentioned, right, written for somebody else, so then again, we just said it's invalid. So what does that mean? So it means that she, the woman, is seen as divorced in the sense that she's now not allowed to marry a priest, a Kohen, but she really isn't divorced and he has to write her a new get. So it's kind of complicated in the sense that she's a divorcee, but she's not divorced. Maybe even with the practice get that we mentioned before, or maybe not, meaning maybe it needed to have been written for somebody, just not this person. Okay, Daf 25. Um, Zeiri says that if you used these gets that we said were invalid, the woman actually can marry a Kohen. If he used the get that was written for either one of his wives and would only decide later, so then the wife can't marry a Kohen, meaning that get is the closest one to a real get. Therefore, in that case, she cannot marry a Kohen afterwards. She's seen as a divorcee. But for all the other cases, she is not. Um, okay. A man cannot write a get saying, I'm going to divorce whoever comes out first from the door, right? Like Yiftach, if you remember in the book of Judges in Shoftim, right? He says, I'm going to sacrifice whatever comes out my door. Again, don't do that, right? Not smart, right? Because he thinks it's going to be a cow or it's going to be right, some other animal, and it turns out it is his daughter. So be careful with that. Okay. So Zohar asks, is she seen as a divorcee and then her husband dies? Is she still not allowed to marry a Kohen? Yes, it seems that she is considered a divorcee and a widow. So that seems to be one opinion. In the Gemara, there seem to be multiple opinions. So I'm not sure in terms of the actual law, but there's definitely opinion that says that even though she's not divorced, she's seen as a divorcee, which would make her a divorcee and a widow. Okay, you cannot compare. So the Gemara tries to compare this case to a Korban Pesach case, remember, we actually learned this in Psachim, where a father says to his kids, right, we're going to have a race. Whoever gets to Jerusalem first, that person, that child will be part of our group for the Korban Pesach. The Gemara says it's not the same thing. Again, one would think that it's retroactive designation. The Gemara says really that's not the case because the parent always wants the children to come, and the race is just to get them there faster. But it does not work in terms of, it's not really Breira. So as we mentioned, Breira does not work for Gittin, for the divorce document, whether it's dependent on someone else, right? Whether if he says whoever comes out the door, or whether it's dependent on himself, right? I'll decide who I want to divorce, right? Based on, I don't know, who cooks me the best dinner. So we say that that's not, we do not do that, and it doesn't, it is not seen as valid. Okay, since we mentioned this Breira case, the Gemara gives us a very classic Breira case that's actually a machloket. The case is, I can't remember if we've learned it before. I feel like we did. But the case is someone has a flask of wine and they bought it from a person who they're not sure if they separated trumot and masrot, right, the tithes. And what does he do? The person says, so he's not going to separate them physically. So he says, the last 10% that's left in this flask is going to be truma, and not 10%, less than that, right? So a certain percentage will be truma, and then 10% will be maser left in the bottom. And now I'm going to drink from the top. Right, so what happens, right? Breira means retroactively everything that's at the bottom becomes trumot and masrot. Some say that this works. Others say it doesn't work. We're concerned maybe the flask is going to break, and then you will not have been able to separate the trumot and masrot, and therefore you'll have had to drink from the wine that was not separated, right? So that's the classic discussion of Breira, right? Can you retroactively designate the wine? Okay, let's say a man says, here is your get now and when I die, right? So now and when I die. So what does that mean? When he dies, it becomes valid. That seems to be also Breira, right? Because only after he dies does it go into effect from before he dies. Or, right, some say, no, this does not work and it never works. Okay, Daf 26, the next Mishnah. The scribe, so again, we're continuing discussing the writing of the get. The scribe can write the tofes. Okay, so again, if you remember in the introduction, there are two parts to the get. The toref, that's the top part, which is specific, the name of the people, the date, the place, that's the toref. Then there's the tofes, right? In modern Hebrew, tofes means a form. So the tofes is the standardized part. So here the Mishnah tells us that the scribe can actually write the standardized part ahead of time, meaning not lishma, not with specific intent, and then he leaves room at the top for the toref, and then later on he fills that in when he knows who it's being written for. For a loan document, you can leave room for the name, the date, the location, and the amount of money, right? So again, here I think it's very interesting. The Gemara is going to explain what we all understand, which is it would be much easier for the scribe to have a form that he has like in the file, and he just pulls it out and fills in the important information, right? As opposed to if you had to write out the entire document, that would obviously be more expensive, take more time. Though you should know that nowadays, even though in many documents there are forms, specifically for a get, if I'm not mistaken, I think that they write the whole thing there and then, right? We're very careful with a get document. Um, Okay, so the Mishnah goes through other documents as well. So a document of a sale needs all right what we just mentioned: the names, the dates, the location of the field, and the amount of money that was used to buy the field. Rabbi Huda says that all of these are actually invalid. Right? He says no. You need to write from the beginning to the end, lishma, right, with proper intent. Rabbi Elazar says they're all valid, right, except for the get, right. Again, the get is going to be the most stringent. Yes, thank you. So Leah is confirming that they do write it all, meaning from the beginning to the end, they write it on the spot with proper intent. So there's no if they try to do it with a form, that is not acceptable for a get. So now the Gemara explains. Um, we also need space not only for the names and the dates, but for the line, you are permitted to all men. Again, as we mentioned, that line is what makes it into a valid get, and therefore it must be written lishma, right, with proper intent. So the Gemara explains that the rabbis made this decree because we wanted to allow the scribes to prepare the document beforehand, or this is according to Rabbi Meir, who says that the whole document could be written in advance. Again, as I mentioned before, Rabbi Meir says that it's the signatures that make it valid. Therefore, the signatures have to be with proper intent, but not the writing. Right? Again, the sages decreed that you cannot, right? Again, Rabbi Meir would hold you can even write the names and the date from beforehand, right? And you have maybe a form with a file. Oh, Yosef with Sprinza. Oh, yeah, hold on, I have that in the back, right? So according to Rabbi Meir, that would be fine. But the sages decreed that at least the Torah needs to be written lishma, right? Again, with proper intent. Um, or again, we say that the Torah can be written before, but we're concerned, right? Maybe they'll have a fight and then it'll be very easy for him to divorce her. Therefore, we say, no, 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 no. You have to write it slowly from the beginning in order to see if maybe the husband will cool down and maybe decide that he does not want to divorce his wife. Or, right, the flip side, according to Rabbi Eliezer, if the husband, let's say, is going overseas, if the tofes is written and he only needs to sign by put in the names, so then it'll be easy for him to give the get, and therefore he won't leave without giving her a get, and she won't get messed up. Again, remember, we don't want the case of an aguna. We don't want somebody to not be able to be released from her marriage. Um, all of these documents need a date, right? You need a date on all gets, whether you're writing a get from marriage or from a rusin, right? A rusin is betrothal. We haven't really discussed this yet, but it's important to recognize that we've discussed the concept before, that there were, in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, you got married in two stages. A rusin, which was a betrothal, right? Hareat mikudeshet li. And then there was nisuin, which is the chuppah. And sometimes they were separated by even up to a year. What is important to understand is that if you did proper erusin, you need a get in order to dissolve that relationship. Even though you might say, wait a minute, they are just engaged. According to Jewish law, if you did erusin, you actually need to get divorced, which is why nowadays we do not do erusin separate from nisuin. We do it together at the same ceremony. which is why we have Erusin and then Nisuin at a wedding. But the Gemara is teaching us here at the bottom of Daf 26 that when you write a get, you need to have the proper date, whether it's a get from Nisuin, from marriage, from full-fledged marriage, to Erusin, um, which is betrothal. Why do we have to make sure that the date is the right date? I think we saw this last week as well. One option is maybe if he's married to a relative of his, and let's say she has an affair and they want to bring her to court, he could say, "Oh, I feel so bad. It's my niece," even though she just cheated on him, but okay. Right? And he might say, "Oh, no, 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 we were actually divorced at that time. Wait, let me change the date on the get," or there was no date on the get. So we make sure that there's a date on the get, so he doesn't falsify when the divorce actually happened, or because of perot. Perot are again Perot are her property, her produce that he has the right to sell. We want to know from when he has the right to sell them to when he does not have the right to sell them, meaning after they get divorced, he can no longer sell them. So we need a date for all of these things. Also for Erusin, if they were only betrothed, because again, they were concerned maybe she would conceive a child and then get divorced. And then if you predate the get, we might think that the woman conceived out of wedlock, and therefore we have to make sure that there's a date on the get, no matter what the no matter what the case is, right? And the Gemara ends the bottom of 26 that the law is that, just like Rabbi Elazar, that all documents you can write the form, the tofes, in advance, except for a divorce, right? Again, a divorce document must be written from start to finish with proper intent. Okay, Daf 27, the Mishnah tells us if someone brought a get and then lost it and then found it right away, so then the get is valid. If not, meaning if they don't find it right away, so then it's invalid, right? We're concerned that maybe it was forged between the time that they lost it to the time that they found it. If he found it in a pouch that he knows is his, or he can recognize the actual document, so then it is valid. Sorry. So the Gemara explains that there's another Mishnah that says that if you find a document, you actually don't return it to the owner because maybe that person threw it out, right? And they didn't want it. But, right, unless the owner says to return it to them, right? So then this seems to contradict our Mishnah, which says you don't return the get if it was lost for a long time, because maybe it was a forgery. So the Gemara explains that maybe it depends on the place that you found the get, right? If you found it in a place where there are many caravans that pass through town, so then it could have fallen from the caravan. You don't know if this was the original document. And therefore you do not return the get. If the court affirmed a document, so then you could return that document, and that's only if there are people with the same, right? And then if there are people with the same name in the same town, so then you don't return the document because we're not sure which Yosef, divorced his wife Sprinza. Okay, let's say you found a get in the marketplace, in the shuk. If the husband admits that he gave it to his wife, so then you return it to the wife. But if he doesn't admit it, so then you do not give it to the wife. Okay, remember we said that um, that if you found something on the ground, you return it or you don't return it. Maybe this is only if it was found right away, um, or maybe it's because the witnesses can say, right, oh, I only signed one document. This is the document that I signed, so you can give it back to the people who own this document. Um, so now the Gemara asks, how long is not right away, right? We talked about finding the get after you lost it right away or not right away. So there's obviously a machloket. One opinion is the time passed that a caravan can come and go, right? That would be too long because, again, maybe it fell from the caravan, or maybe the time it would take for another person to pass by, or maybe for another person to come and actually stand there long enough to drop the get, or maybe it's the time it takes to write a new get, or the time it takes to read the get, right? So you can see all of these are different amounts of time of what is right away. Um, if you give specific marks, right? So here the Gemara starts talking about what's called in Hebrew simanim, right? So let's say something is lost, right? So someone will say, prove to me that it's yours, right? Describe it, right? Give me simanim. Simanim are marks. Now, there are two types of simanim in Jewish law. One is a standard siman, right? It was a black wallet that folded in half, right? That is descriptive, but I could also be describing, you know, 20 other, right, 20,000 other black wallets. So I'm describing what it looks like, but it's very standard indicator, thank you, or identifier. Another is what's called a specific siman, and that is, right, there's a tear on the top right corner of the first, I don't know, fold, right? So then that's very specific, and only right people who have seen it before can identify it. And if you give these specific identifiers, it works, but not standard ones. But if it was attached to this person's objects, right? So let's say you find the get in that person's knapsack, right? Or attached to that person's wallet. So then we assume that it's the same document and it is still valid. Daf 28 says the law is what's the time? The time is that another person didn't pass there, and that would be the time it would take in order to make it valid or invalid. Okay, the next Mishnah, if an agent brings a get and then when he left the husband, so the husband was sick, or maybe the husband was old. He still, right, the agent now travels to Israel. He still gives the wife the get, and we assume that the husband is still alive. This daf is going to talk about the concept of chazaka. Chazaka means an assumption based on the last uh, the status of the person, right? The last time the agent saw the husband was alive. So there is a chazaka that the husband is still alive, right? An assumption. Um, let's say a wife of a Kohen, um, right? Her husband goes overseas. So the Mishnah tells us that she can continue eating truma even if her husband is overseas. We assume he's still alive, right? He left alive. So we assume he's still alive. And therefore, because her husband is a Kohen, she can eat truma. She continues to eat truma. The last case is that um, if a person sends a sacrifice, um, so then right, a sin offering, a korban chatat from outside of Israel. So then when it gets to the temple, we can assume that the person is still alive, and therefore the Kohen can sacrifice this sacrifice. We don't have to assume maybe he died in the meantime. And now the Gemara discusses what does it mean, old? So I apologize to all the listeners, but the Gemara says, what is old? Old is what's called gvurot, right, which is strength, which is the 80 years old. If the person got to 80, right, they should live and be well till 120. But it seems that I had an interesting conversation with my Daf Yomi learners this morning in terms of we know that their lifespan in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara was much younger. So it's interesting that they're discussing 80 as being, very old. So then, right, the Gemara says, then we assume that the person is not still alive, or if the person was deathly ill. If they were just regular ill, the Gemara actually says most ill people recover. Therefore, we assume they're alive. But if they were deathly ill, so then we assume that maybe the person died. The Gemara says, wait a minute, what do you mean 80? We have a statement that says even if he's 100, we assume he's still alive. So interesting, right? I can't imagine that there were people who lived till 100 in the time of the Mishnah or the Gemara, but you never know. So the Gemara actually says, which I think again is just fascinating, the Gemara says, well, if you got to 80, so now you're really old, but you could die at any moment. However, if you got past 80 and now you're 100, so then we assume, somebody mentioned this morning that someone once said this woman was 90 and she said to somebody, I think God just forgot about me. So the Gemara seems to imply that after a certain age, the likelihood of you living to much longer is high, meaning it's just a fascinating concept. So it seems that they assume that you will live a long life, and everyone should just live till 120. Okay, the Gemara continues that there's a machloket if we are concerned about death, again, in general, just like maybe we're concerned about the barrel breaking. Remember the case that I gave you a few minutes ago about the barrel of wine or the flask of wine. Remember, we said some are concerned, oh, it's going to break, so you can't separate the trumot in that way. So it's interesting how the Gemara compares the flask breaking to a person dying, right? Meaning things that are unforeseeable, but maybe at some point inevitable. So the Gemara says, no, we do not compare the two things. Those are two separate things. Okay, the last Mishnah for today, Rabbi Elazar ben Parta said the following three cases, and the sages agreed with him in what he said. And we're going to continue with the concept of chazaka. Again, chazaka, assumption. We can make certain assumptions based on the last time we saw, right, this person or the place. What's the case? If a city is besieged, right, by enemies, or a boat was known to have been in a storm, or a person was tried in a capital case, in all of these cases, we assume that everyone is still alive, right? The chazaka is we left them alive. We don't know anything else, so we assume that they're alive. However, if the city was captured, right? So you see how there's a difference. One is a siege. We don't know the outcome. Once it's captured, or the ship was lost at sea, or the person was taken out to be executed, in all of these cases, we actually don't know what happened, right, for sure. And therefore, we're going to apply the stringencies of the person being alive and the stringencies of a person having died, right? Because we don't know, right? And if it's a woman who is married to a Kohen, or a female Kohen who is married to a Yisrael. Either way, she doesn't eat truma. Okay, um, so now, first of all, it's just important to understand that these were very um, important cases that have a lot of practical applications, especially post Holocaust, post 9/11. Right? What do we do when we don't have information? Right? Do we assume, oh, the last time we saw this person, they were alive, so maybe they're alive? Do we assume that, right, if we hear that everyone in this town was killed, do we assume that they were killed? And these were really practical cases throughout both issues, both cases, and throughout many times in history, where the rabbis had to determine the status of, let's say, a woman whose husband was missing because of one of these tragedies. So the Gemara explains, we mentioned a person being executed or being tried for a capital crime. So the Gemara asks, are we talking about a non-Jewish court or a Jewish court? In a non-Jewish court, the Gemara says we assume that the person was executed um, because um, again, once they're being led to the execution, we assume they're going to be executed, right? Again, there's no concept of, right, the presidential pardon in the last 10 seconds. It seems in those days there was no such thing. The Gemara says, wait a minute, but they could have been bribed. Maybe we could bribe them and they won't kill the person. So the Gemara says, which is interesting that I guess this concept existed, 2,000 years ago. But the Gemara actually says that they could bribe a court until the verdict comes out. But once the verdict comes out, that's it. They're not going to change the decision. Maybe the verdict of a Jewish court can be overturned and not final. And the Gemara seems to say, again, there's a distinction between it being a Jewish court and a non-Jewish court. And then the question is, do we believe people who say, oh, did you hear so-and-so was taken out to be executed? The Gemara has a term. In Hebrew, it's mesiach lefi tumo, which means when a person is casually talking, let's say to their neighbor, right, or on the phone, right, and you walk by and you hear it, we actually believe those statements more so than when someone comes to maybe testify because they might have ulterior motives. But when you're talking to somebody, on the street or on the phone, so then generally people are not going to lie about these things. Except, says the Gemara, except if the person was the actual executioner, because, right, the executioner might say, right, and here we're talking about the non-Jewish executioner. We're concerned that the non-Jewish executioner is going to, right, exaggerate. Oh, you'll never guess who I killed today. Even though he's talking casually, we say that he's still trying to, boast, and we don't necessarily take his word for what he says. The top of Daf 29, the Gemara tells us that in a Jewish court, once the verdict was passed, there's no changing the verdict, right? So that's a final, that was final. And therefore, if a person was sentenced to death and taken out to be killed, we assume that they were killed. That's not a fun note to end on. So we will end on a wonderful note of wishing everyone a wonderful week. I saw, Aliza, you wrote Yom Huledet Sameach. Is it your birthday? Yes?
It wasn't just that my birthday is coming as soon as 3 stars on Shabbos, on Friday night, but I get to give the Devar Torah in a Chabad house.
Wow, that
I
is
know.
amazing.
Yeah, it was a big deal.
That is amazing. Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you very much.
Should have many, many more in health.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Um,
And I actually